Please be seated. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. It was good to be with you last Sunday here for worship and pancakes. And if you heard me do the prayer, I said I would be preaching today and tomorrow, and I'd be looking for things to challenge you with during that time. Last sermon I did was 5 months ago. I've been a pastor for 56 years, and I've never gone 5 months without preparing a sermon and preaching. But here I am today. And so I want to challenge you once again. The gospel that I just read has lots to think about. Only 6 verses in that gospel. And it's not an easy passage. And I kind of like those that aren't so easy. It's a chance for challenge. I usually check with William Barclay, who wrote commentaries many years ago before I ever preach on a particular text. And Barclay says the gospel that I just read today is very disconnected. There could be four, 4 separate themes as far as that is concerned. I could do a 4-point sermon this afternoon, but that would take a while. So I won't do that. In the seminary, they taught us to preach 3-point sermons. I never followed that. There's a lot of stuff at the seminary I never followed. You probably figured that out. I like to stick to a 1-point sermon. And if I figure if I can get 1 point across, then I've been somewhat successful. So, when I was at the seminary, I didn't do all the stuff they taught me to do. They said we should always write out manuscripts for what we were preaching, so you could read your manuscript and have all the words right. I wrote 1 manuscript in 56 years of ministry, and that's the one they made me write at the seminary, but I've never done it since. So I'll stick with my 1 point today. Lots of pastors have stuck with that 3-point sermons, but not me. So I want to focus in on the main point of what the gospel is about today. And I think you could probably figure that out because it's in the first 3 words. Give us more faith. And it's important for all of us. We have a very bad misconception about what faith does. And that'll be my challenge today. Faith is used 328 times in the Bible. Only 18 of them are in the Old Testament. But faith is so much a part of our terminology and something I think we very seldom really understand. We call the creed. It's in the bulletin that says, our confession of faith. That's not true. It's not our confession of faith. It's what the church taught us what to believe. It's a statement of our belief, not a statement of our faith. So, and of course, there's a lot of other stuff I don't kind of go along with. Just like in our confession that we use here, which I have never used because I don't believe it. It says we confess that we are in bondage to sin. I don't believe that. And I hope you don't believe you're in bondage to sin either, because we've been given forgiveness by the grace of God. We put too much emphasis on what sin does for us. And so let's look at the gospel and our subject of faith. The apostles asked Jesus, increase our faith. When's the last time you asked for that? When's the last time you asked for an increase of faith? Are you satisfied with the faith that you have? Are you doing with your life what faith would have you do? The question, increase our faith. And you know what the answer was from Jesus? You don't need much. Did you catch that? He said, you don't need much. Jesus said, you just need a little bit of faith. Itsy bitsy faith. And that's why he used a connection with the mustard seed, which is one of the smallest seeds that there is. In the words of the gospel, if you have the faith the size of a mustard seed, you can do this and do that. Just a little faith. Uproot a mulberry tree. How many of you have uprooted mulberry trees? How many of you know what a mulberry tree is? I don't either. And he said you can go plant it in the sea. Why would you want to plant a tree in the sea? I sure wouldn't. The other synoptic gospels use the same mustard seed illustration, but they talk about moving mountains into the sea. Ever hear of somebody doing that? What would you do if you had that kind of faith? Would you make trees move? If I would take the gospel literally, with my faith I could do those kind of things, I'd become a landscaper. And I would move saguaros from one spot to another because they are hard to move. I would replace our fairways in the fall with new grass without overseeding if I had that kind of faith. Now, I'm being facetious, but I think Jesus was being facetious also when he made those comments in Luke. Not meaning literally that faith can move trees and that faith can move mountains, but help us to free us from obstacles that stand in our way. Faith helps us to move through difficulties. But sometimes we get that wrong idea of faith, and I'll dwell on that. Faith and belief are not the same thing, even though we confuse them in that way. Ever hear of someone believing that they didn't get what they asked God because they didn't have enough faith? Did you ever hear that? That's not too uncommon. The idea that if you have the right faith, it'll all work out. If it didn't work out, you didn't have enough faith. There have been people who have felt guilty when they prayed for God to do something for someone that they loved, and it didn't happen, and they thought they didn't have enough faith. They were taught, if you have that strong faith, you can do anything. Move mulberry bushes and mountains. And we have the idea, the wrong idea, that if you get enough people of faith to pray about something, it'll all work out. Faith will make it happen. That's a misconception of faith. That we can get whatever we want to happen. If you have enough faith, your prayers will be answered. My wife, I may have told you this before, tells me about her little sister, 10 years younger than her. When she'd gone to Sunday school, they told her if she had faith, anything could happen. You can make anything work. And so she decided, because she had a wagon that she'd like to have motorized, that she would ask God to help her motorize that wagon. And so she knew she had to do something. So she got, remember what a Victrola was? And I think that our candidate Joe mentioned kind of that in one of his speeches because he remembers what those were all about. But her little sister believed that. And so she got a Victrola, and when you wind up and you crank. And then she got an inner tube and she cut it up so she had a big band that you could use as kind of what do you call it? Not a driver for that. And so she put the Victrola in the wagon, and she wrapped the inner tube around to put the record on, the turntable. Thank you, dear. It's put around the turntable, and she prayed that her wagon would run, and nothing happened. She was devastated. She didn't think that this business of faith made any sense at all if that would not work the way she wanted it to work. She's very active in her church today, not because of her wagon. But our concepts of belief and faith cause a lot of alienation with God. With all of that faith, why doesn't something happen? Faith. What's the point? I've had a subscription to guideposts for years and years and years. And I would keep some old issues, and I'd have a stack of them, and my wife would want me to get rid of them. And of course, when we moved to El Dorado, I had to get rid of a lot of stuff. And I looked at those again, and I saw this article. And it's been an article called "The Real Catherine." The Real Catherine. Catherine Marshall. Remember that name? The widow of Peter Marshall, who was a chaplain of the United States Senate for many, many years. And he died at a very early age. And she wrote the book called A Man Called Peter. He was a Presbyterian minister. She also wrote a great book called Christy. And I think most of you are old enough maybe to remember some of those things. Like I said, her husband Peter died. But then she went on to live and leave a legacy of her own. And she died herself in 1983 after writing about Peter and about Christy for Guideposts. But she married again. She married an editor for Guideposts. She and Peter had a son, and they named him Peter. And Peter's wife was Edith. And they had a son, and they named him Peter, the third Peter Marshall. When they had children, Catherine Marshall was excited and sent messages and announcements to her friends. And the baby that they had a very bad weakness. And she asked that they would all pray for this baby. And she asked that the editor, her husband, would get as many people of faith so they could pray for healing. And she got a dozen to do that. 2 nights later, the boy died. 3 years later, her son and his wife had another child, a strong baby girl. And then 2 years later, Catherine was told that they had another daughter. In the birth of that daughter, she had the same symptoms as Peter had some time before. It was genetic. There had only been at that time about 40 cases of this particular illness. The writer of the article talked about Catherine. And Catherine Marshall said, "No tears, no talk of death. If we only have faith, the baby will be healed." Catherine got 16 people of faith to pray around the clock. And they took turns at the bedside of this young girl named Amy Catherine. 6 weeks after the birth, Catherine was at the bedside when Amy died, in spite of all their faith. Catherine went into deep depression, blaming her lack of faith on the failure for the cure of Amy Catherine. And she said, "It's as if God is gone too." She stopped writing. Her husband urged the author of the article that was written about her to encourage her to write again. And she did. And she said before that, "I'm not going to write anymore. I found out I don't know anything about God." And for months she didn't. But then she started to get up in the morning and give praise to God. And she started feeling that presence once again. And you see, that's what faith is all about. Faith is about experiencing the presence of God with us. It is not about our belief. You know, sometimes I look at hymn writers creating much of our theology. You maybe know Bette Midler. She sang a very popular song. Do you know what it was? From a Distance. From a Distance. I would not sing that song because I do not like that song one bit. The church we've been attending, they had a soloist that sang that some weeks ago. And I think it's a shame to have that kind of theology. The idea, God is watching us. Where? From a distance. I hope you don't believe that. Because faith is the whole business, that we believe that we're close to God and that God is with us right where we are. The author of the article about Catherine asked her, "What's the main thing you learned?" She said, "I began to see that with Amy Catherine, I didn't have faith in God. I had faith in faith, as though the strength of our own belief determines the outcome. That thinking puts human beings in the center and not God, who is a God of grace." That's the point that Catherine Marshall makes. It's not our faith that manipulates God. In fact, we are not saved by faith. I'm sure all of you have believed that you are. We are not saved by faith. We are saved by the grace of God. If we're saved by faith, it's something that we do, and not what God does. Faith helps us live in that saved relationship and feeling that God is with us and is close to us, not from a distance in all circumstances. We can face our obstacles, mulberry trees or mountains. And that's what faith is all about. That's the point of what we have when we have our faith.